Hi, this is Steve Hargadon, and I'm here with Audrey Waters, virtually here with Audrey Waters. It's the 24th of February, and this is the Hack Education Week podcast, weekly podcast.
Yes.
Hi, Audrey.
Hello.
You were uncharacteristically quiet this week.
Well, this week was, I've been traveling. I've actually been in the Bay Area this week, so having lots of sort of meetings with folks and actually not getting a lot of writing done. Although I'm sitting here probably looking at a weekend's worth of blog posts that I will be churning out instead. So.
Oh, good. Well, so your first post was a little bit self-reflective.
Yes.
It had to do with the question I asked you was why should anybody care about a scratch for HTML5?
Right.
And I didn't mean that question critically, and I hope you didn't take it critically.
No, but it was a good one.
To it.
Yeah, it was a good one for, I think, to think about. And I mean, obviously, as someone who runs a blog that I hope people read, it was good in terms of thinking about how some of the coverage of my blog will change. But I think that it sort of gave me pause to think too about what exactly, sort of how am I framing some of these questions, and what really do we mean when we use this, what's really sort of a shorthand that I've used in my conversations with Mozilla, in terms of what does it mean to build a scratch for HTML5.
So it seems like that exists on two levels. One is I actually enjoyed reading your notes from the interviews. But I think sort of the deeper question is, what's the value and importance of this kind of a tool? Mm-hmm. And I want to play the devil's advocate, right? So you know how I feel about a lot of these things. But if I'm thinking about web programming, I'm not a car guy. I don't really know the nuts and bolts of a car, but I use the car to drive around. Why should I know more of the nuts and bolts of the web?
Well, I think that we're sort of seeing this shift where where the importance of having, this is importance of web literacy, and I think that we talk a lot about tech literacy in terms of being a user of technology, and I think that that technology is becoming such an important part of how we work, how we create, how we do business, how we participate in civic life and social life, that I think that if we're only thinking about how we use technology and we're not sort of knowledgeable about how we can build this technology, I think that we won't be taking advantage of the tools to our full potential. And I think that as we saw a month or so ago with the discussions around SOPA, I think that the stakes are very high in terms of sort of potentially losing what has become this really powerful space for open community participation, whether we think of that in terms of learning, or whether we think of that just in terms of sort of information sharing.
Have you come to any conclusions about the Mozilla project? Has anything filtered up for you?
Not yet. I have a bunch of conversations sort of lined up in the next few weeks. That this is sort of looking at my schedule, because we'll be at South by Southwest EDU in a couple of weeks too. I'm doing a lot of conferences in the next few weeks. But I just actually got off the phone with Ryan Seahorse, who's the founder of Code Now, which is a program that you and I have talked about before. He's working with disadvantaged youth in the DC area and helping them get up and running with programming. And I wanted to talk with Ryan because I think too often, particularly when engineers build learn to program tools, too often we sort of start the conversation way too far down the line. And so sort of how do we get people sort of up and running and interested, and even interested in wanting to learn programming, or in this case sort of web building. And I sort of wanted to circle back around and talk with Ryan again about the things that he's doing to make it work in his community. And I think one of the things that he stressed is that it's really not just, and I think we'd know this already, it really can't just be a tool. It can't just be a matter of having a web-based program or a piece of software, or even something like the Lego robotics, a hardware solution. There has to be a multi-pronged approach in building sort of peer-to-peer learning and a social support network and mentorship, and access to the tools. So, I mean, I don't think that anyone here was sort of thinking that sort of build a tool and magically all of us will have sort of reach web literacy enlightenment. But I think it was a good reminder that this has to be a multi-pronged approach, I think.
So I'm imagining that you're not getting a lot of the ignoring Papert fallacy here, right?
Right.
Are most of these folks pretty aware of that material?
Well, I mean, this is the bias of the researcher here, that I probably am purposefully at this stage reaching out to people who I know who I know would pass my Papert test. So I think that the conversations are probably skewed in that way. That these are people who are, I think, thinking deeply about learning rather than, I would say, thinking superficially about shiny tools.
Okay, so TextYard open sources their code, and one enterprising student says he's thinking about building on top of that code a textbook exchange site. But I had a hard time seeing sort of revolutionary change from this. What's the importance of TextYard doing open sourcing their code?
Well, I think that the TextYard was a company, and they've actually decided to move on to a different project. But they were a startup that wanted to build a little tool so that students could sort of do some price comparison, so that when they knew what courses they were taking at their university, they could fill out what university they were at, what courses they were at, and this little web-based interface would tell them where to find their books for the cheapest. And I think, as most college students would be quick to tell you, frankly, oftentimes the campus bookstore, particularly if we're talking a new textbook, the campus bookstore is not the cheapest place to find your books. And so it was really just a tool to sort of make it easier to do some consumer research. But that data is actually quite hard or the university bookstores don't necessarily make it easy to get to that data. Oftentimes they don't offer their own web interface to even let you see what their prices look like. And so this team has sort of built a number of web scraping tools, which is a pretty common practice, I think, to sort of be able to harvest the data from a website in order to find the material so that they could offer it up to others. And I think that I think that we're starting to really, I think, more and more people are recognizing that all of these discussions around student textbooks, whether it's the move to digital textbooks or the decisions that students are making not to purchase textbooks, that price is still this huge factor, and really pricing is not transparent. And I think the hope of the TextYard folks, by open sourcing the tools, is that someone else is going to sort of pick up this work and move it forward in an effort to sort of force the campus bookstores, force the publishers to be a lot more transparent with how pricing works.
So essentially, if I remember correctly, there are 5 or 6 kind of major storefronts that most universities or colleges used for their textbooks. So what TextYard did was to figure out how to scrape the data from those major players.
Right.
Is that right? Right. And so there are other cases that you've talked about with scraping data from school websites, right? The One School and the mobile app. I think what I like about it is this sort of the idea that this can be done independent of the institutions. But I'm having a hard time sort of seeing the scope. Is there the potential for a lot more than we're seeing now?
Well, I think that I like it on one hand, I like it very much that people are doing this independent of the institutions. But on the other hand, I think it is a good reminder to these institutions that they could probably open up data. They could probably have an API and make some of this data accessible, and still allow students and startups to sort of build products on top of their data, but at least so that they would sort of be able to sort of see what people were doing with data, rather than just leave it to web scraping.
Although that felt like kind of a stretch for me, meaning they would have to sort of voluntarily say, we're willing to actually have our prices be negatively impacted. Felt like that would be hard for somebody in a management position at a university bookstore to promote.
Well, I think that the one of the problems with price transparency too, though, is I don't even know that professors are that aware of the pricing, and I think that the pressure is certainly, noticing that your university bookstore is consistently overcharging what Amazon offers is one thing, but I think for professors to know too that the textbooks that they're offering, how those even compare to other options as well. I mean, I think that the students are in the dark, and I think that professors are in the dark, and I think that that's a problem.
Well, the students aren't too much in the dark because you cite in your weekly summary that fewer than 60% of them are buying the latest edition. So I figure they know they don't want to pay the full big bucks, right?
Right. I mean, and so I think that this is what makes it sort of an interesting thing to sort of help crack open the tools, because and again, I think that it's partially about the students, but I think it's also how can we how can we help better sort of educate the professors too? I mean, how can we make sure that sort of professors are choosing good options and affordable options for their students as well? I mean, and why would you say buy the ninth edition of the Intro to Biology textbook when you're really using the same first three chapters that are also in the sixth edition and the seventh edition and the eighth edition?
You would have I gave a talk this week in Arkansas, the TCAL conference, and I put up a slide with Donald Trump and a picture of textbooks saying, "Fire your textbooks." You're fired. Okay, so also interesting in that book and industry study group was that there's been an increase in rentals, but no increase in mobile device usage, and I think that you've been saying that for a while.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we hear so much excitement in certain circles about the possibility of digital textbooks, sort of, liberating students from carrying around heavy books, that they'll be more affordable, and clearly students, even if they're not opting to buy the brand new edition, they're really not using their mobile devices, and they're owners of mobile devices, but they aren't using their mobile devices to consume educational content.
Okay, so Kindertown creates an educational app store within the Apple Marketplace.
Mm-hmm.
It felt like the discovery of those apps was very dependent on one person. Did I read that right?
No, there's a team of that they have a team of educators who help uncover and rate and assess them, but it definitely is their team curating them, as opposed to crowdsourcing, sort of crowdsourcing reviews or other ways of uncovering quality app content.
So do you think we're going to see more of this? Because it certainly feels as though that's a great start, but wouldn't you want educators and parents and students to be able to participate in the review process?
I think that that's a really interesting question, and I should note that after I published this blog post on Kindertown, in which I made the argument that that discovery was this huge problem, it was actually announced that Apple has purchased a startup called Chomp, which did the same a similar sort of process, which was it was an app within the App Store that helped surface and make recommendations on apps for you. But I think one of the challenges, when we think about educational content and turning it over to sort of a broad review process, is I worry about sort of replicating what I call sort of it's like the phenomenal failure of Yelp reviews, in which it's actually very hard to judge much by the star rating and the write up in a Yelp review. you can you can pick one of your favorite restaurants, and the reviews are sort of all over the place. And I mean, people could say sort of like, well, it was the lousiest meal I ever ate because, the person sitting next to me smelled like cigarette smoke. And it's like, well, I don't, that's meaningless. And so I think that, I think when we think about I think it's a challenge. How do we rate and review educational content that doesn't fall prey to sort of those sorts of reviews that you see already in the iTunes store and that you see in Amazon?
Interesting. My first thought was, has Google done anything in this area with their own app marketplace?
No, and their own app marketplace is just as bad. And I think that Kindertown. It was interesting. Kindertown said that they were not that interested in offering a similar service for the Android market, which I think is an interesting indication of where people see educational app content, but they were perhaps interested in thinking about a process to review web apps. But I think that both the educational, the Chrome web app store and the Android market, I think they suffer from the same silly 5-star, silly sort of rating system.
So I didn't miss any posts, right? I mean, there were just those 3 before we get to the weekly.
Well, I just posted one that you probably didn't see about the release today of the New York City teacher data.
Oh, no, I think is this the one, the Bill Gates one? Did you do a fuller story on it?
I did do a fuller story on it, yeah.
Well, so let's start there, and you can tell me what I didn't see. What is value-added rating? Why is Bill Gates opposed to it, and why does he actually sound somewhat progressive?
Well, I should say Bill Gates is not opposed to value. I mean, Bill Gates is one of these folks who has been a big proponent of the value-added assessment. And to explain what that is, it's a way of purportedly measuring the impact that a teacher has on a student by looking at students' test scores and sort of having a predictive model that will say how well you think a student will perform in the next year's standardized tests. And if a student does better or worse than what you've predicted, that's the value add of a teacher. That's the impact that a teacher has had, for better or worse, on a student's performance. And so this value added measurement has been something that a lot of quote education reformers like Bill Gates have said that we need to implement in order to identify good teachers and bad teachers. And of course, and oftentimes too, sort of pay good teachers more and fire the bad teachers.
It didn't sound like that was his position in the editorial. Is it possible he's actually changed his position?
His position in the editorial is that the New York City School District today, after, I should say, lengthy legal battles, has released the names of 18,000 teachers in the city, English and math teachers, released their names, their individual names, and their rankings based on this methodology. And so Gates is questioning that process. So it's one thing to sort of have a number of methods by which we will assess what constitutes an effective teacher. And I would say actually he has gotten a lot more nuanced. Bill Gates has become a lot more nuanced in what he thinks that looks like, in terms of sort of peer-to-peer review, classroom observation. So he does want there to be multiple ways of assessing teacher effectiveness, but he's quite opposed to this notion of releasing individuals' names to appear in the New York Times, which the New York Times plans to release these teachers' names to the public. He does not think that has anything to do at all with helping move this conversation forward in identifying effective teaching.
Yeah, and certainly he seems to call out specifically that shaming just doesn't help anybody.
Right. So it seems, right now the main proponents of value add and of making this data publicly available are Arne Duncan, Joel Klein, the former city school chancellor who now works for Rupert Murdoch's News Corps, Stephen Brill, who famously wrote about the rubber rooms in New York, and Mayor Mike Bloomberg.
So it's not the case that somebody's wanting us to see this data in order to show how absurd it is, but they actually feel like this is valuable information.
They think that, and I mean, I should say, I think that most parents do want to, I think that it is something that parents are concerned about. Like, how do you know if your child is attending a quote good school? How do you know if you have a good teacher? I think that is something that parents are interested in knowing, and I would say parents have a right to know how well students perform and teachers perform in a school. But I would say that using what is no doubt a really flawed tool, and then having this sort of public exposure of people's names is really not about having a smart conversation about improving the American school system. LA did this a couple years ago, the LA Times.
Right, I remember.
Yeah.
Well, so I'll just refer people to Dennis Littke's book, The Big Picture, in which he has 2 pages of questions parents can go ask the school to actually find out how well the school is performing. So 2 Canadian universities, what is this about? Emailing a link to a copyrighted paper is the same as photocopying it?
Well, there are a number of pieces of legislation circling governments all over the world right now that have to do with copyright treaties and copyright law. And this past week, the University of Western Ontario and the University of Toronto, two of Canada's sort of largest universities, signed a deal with the government saying that anytime a student or professor emailed a link to a piece of copyrighted material, that was the same as photocopying, and so copyright, there should be a charge for sort of similar sort of charge that you'd have to get for copyright clearance to use copyrighted material in the classroom. So there'll be a blanket per student per year charge for those universities. And furthermore, they will be monitoring the email of faculty and students to make sure to sort of monitor for compliance. So scary and stupid
Oh my gosh.
a number of levels.
So is this related to the way in which Canada addressed the music piracy issue, where there was a certain charge on top of CDs that was intended to cover copying? Are they trying to build off of that model?
I think I'm not sure if it's directly related to that or if it's related to the ACTA treaty I think that, again, I think it is sort of connected to the publishing industry and the music and film industry, much like SOPA here in this country, of, I think, sort of cracking down on new technologies that some of these industries believe are violating copyright, and in the meantime, sort of undermining logic at the very least.
Fascinating. Okay, I loved the idea of an iTunes competitor, in this case, Learning Hub, but I was surprised that Samsung was behind this. Is there any history here that I should know? Yeah,
there are very few details, and Samsung will purportedly sort of unveil this. There's the big Mobile World Congress next week in Europe, in the Netherlands, I believe, and they'll be releasing more information. And I've actually asked on Twitter a couple of times if anyone sort of has more information. I'm very curious to see which institutions decide to participate in an iTunes U competitor. Of course, Samsung does have the Galaxy Tab, which appears at the moment. I suppose if you don't count the Kindle Fire, that is probably the most popular of the Android tablets. But it is interesting that this is a Samsung move and not an Android move.
Yeah, it is interesting. Anything that we should know about Blackboard's Dev Ed?
So I think this is a trend to pay attention to in terms of for-profit companies stepping in to help offer remediation classes for college students that come to campus ill-prepared, unprepared for the kinds of courses that they'd need to take in order to graduate. Sort of statistically, supposedly we're seeing more and more college students enter school who aren't ready to take sort of what would be, for example, sort of 100 level math. And so they have to do a bunch of remediation classes in order to be ready to take the classes that they need, the credits that they need to graduate. But isn't it, it's, a lot of these classes now are getting farmed out to blended learning and online learning for-profits. And so Blackboard is teaming up with K-12 in order to deliver this, to have an option to sort of deliver these classes, these remedial classes, to campuses.
So I got notice last week that Blackboard is closing down my final consulting work with them. So as of the beginning of March, I won't have to dance around Blackboard stories anymore. Data Wind has only shipped 10,000 out of a 100,000 unit order for these low-cost Indian tablets that was potentially going to be a 1 million piece order.
Right.
Quality level isn't very high, but no huge surprise because of the below $50 price, maybe even a $35 price. Mm-hmm. But it still kind of feels like if you only ship 10,000 units, something else is really wrong.
Yeah, sort of several different reports in regards to this project, and the Indian government is sort of underwriting. They're subsidizing a lot of this work too. But DataWind, the company that's been responsible for sort of manufacturing these low cost tablets, has clearly been unable to build and deliver them. Looks like the Indian government might be looking for other suppliers now, but is also recognizing that they might have to. There might have to be some wiggle room on that price point. That, I mean, as you said, when you've got a $35 tablet, you've got a $35 tablet.
ISTE says they're closing their Second Life presence. I don't think that's any huge surprise. But why is ISTE so absent from all of these ed tech discussions that are going on?
Is this a trick question?
No, is it a trick question? I read it as a trick question.
No. Well, I suppose, in disclosure for people that don't know, I did work for ISTE for not quite 2 years. But I don't know. I mean, I think that this is something that, I think that this is a really good question, and I wonder how much ISTE and other long-standing education technology organizations are sort of more interested in what the big education corporations like Pearson are up to than they are thinking around the margins where some of the most innovative things are happening. And it feels, I think that Second Life, not to sort of offend anyone who's a fan of Second Life, I think in the virtual world is certainly an interesting place for learning, but I think that, it's sort of, in some ways, it feels very symbolic of not paying attention to where other things are going and investing in the big and the old, rather than taking some risk to be part of the new.
Yeah, to ISTE's credit, they've been so supportive of the Bloggers Cafe and Niju BloggerCon, which is now Social EdCon. But I think they don't really put any money into those, but they certainly put a lot of time and effort and money into the Second Life piece. And I don't know that I could have predicted. I was never a huge Second Life fan because of the hardware requirements.
Right.
I had a hard time seeing, broader adoption. But that one I can kind of, understand the process that took place, because there were so many people drinking the Kool-Aid and so many who were excited about it. But I am just sort of baffled by the lack of participation in these other discussions.
I wonder if it's something to do with social media. That I don't see ISTE having a big presence there.
No, they don't. But it just doesn't feel like they're proactively getting. I just don't even read quotes by people from ISTE when a big tech story comes out, and maybe I'm missing them. But it feels like they haven't taken a leadership role at a time when they could, and maybe that's just the difficulty of being a large organization that now has all kinds of stakeholders and and might worry about taking a position that wasn't the standard one.
Right.
Okay, so what is the School of Data?
So this is a new initiative that the Open Knowledge Foundation and Peer-to-Peer University are exploring, and I think it's a recognition that data science has become a very hot new career, and that we don't necessarily have sort of folks who are trained in data science, which is sort of a little bit statistics, it's a little bit engineering, but when it comes to computer programming, it's actually computer programming oftentimes with massive data sets at the sort of scale, again, that requires a specific sort of programming knowledge. And so I think that the two organizations are sort of coming together to think about ways that they can offer an informal learning environment with, based on the PDPU model, an informal learning environment where they can help build out a community of data scientists, people sort of trained in the thinking and in the skills necessary to work with these data sets in an intelligent and meaningful way.
It sure feels like we're going to learn a lot about the world from big data.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is tangential, but there was a story in the New York Times this week about Target and how its marketing company now can predict if you're pregnant before you sort of told other people based on your shopping purchases.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
Fascinating. I will say one of the most interesting books I've read in a long time is this book called Grouped by the guy who helped start Google Plus and now works at Facebook, and using that data to kind of look at how we interact socially. And I really enjoy hearing those conclusions and kind of mapping them against how people actually seem to be acting. I had a kind of a mixed reaction. I didn't really drill down too far, but this National Education Startup Challenge, challenging students to build projects for education, I couldn't decide if that was liberating or exploitative.
I'm not sure. I mean, there actually aren't a lot of details about this, and this is part of a larger, I mean, there have been a number of efforts under the Obama administration, what it's calling its challenge.gov platform, in which it is asking the community at large to sort of help build the apps to solve their own questions. I mean, earlier, I guess it was last year, they asked university students to sort of help, how can we help build tools to help combat sexual harassment and sexual assault on campus, and I think that that's a good example of how you can how those sorts of things aren't necessarily going to be solved, certainly by the free market, and it's sort of taking some real cultivation of the people who are most impacted and help support them in building the tools. In this case, this National Education Startup Challenge, it doesn't quite. I mean, in some ways, it feels so broad. It doesn't quite feel like it's the same sort of small directed set of problem owners with an easy to identify or easy to build sort of goal. It's very loose. I mean, how do we help make people like middle school better? I don't know. Is there an app that will do that?
I see you making another one of those little cartoony things. What are they called?
Those little videos.
Little videos.
Yeah, I don't remember what they're called.
Whatever it is.
Yeah.
So Intern Match is going to do a Google Hangout event. Has Google Hangout changed enough that you can do a big event?
They have a thing that's still in private beta called Google On Air, and it still allows the sort of 10 people to participate in video chat with each other, but it's sort of live streamed to YouTube. In fact, I think President Obama held a hangout a couple of weeks ago, and so a specially selected group of 10 folks could appear in the video chat with him and ask him questions directly, but then it was sort of live streamed elsewhere. And that's what Intern Match is sort of taking advantage of this. And it's actually Intern Match I like Intern Match a lot. I think that they're a startup originally out of Seattle, that a group of students again that have sort of figuring out a way to sort of solve their own problems and recognizing that the campus recruitment process is really broken, and it's broken if you don't want a job at Goldman Sachs. I mean, that's usually who are at campus recruiting and internship events. So if you want to work at a nonprofit, for example, it's hard to find internships. But it's also broken if if you're not in the know, like if you don't have connections to the people that are going to tell you the sort of secret information that will help you land an internship at Google. And so Intern Match is, they're just sort of peeling back some of the secrecy, and their day-long hangout is going to give students an opportunity to, well, for example, ask Google those pointed questions, which is sort of, how do you get, what happens at an engineering interview at Google? What's it like, really?
I love that. Can you get me on that list for the private beta?
Yeah.
Come on.
I'll pull my strings. We've only said nice things about. Wait, have we said only nice things about Google? I did say their Android store was sort of crappy, so probably not. Sorry, Steve.
Something else I really liked was this hackathon in Boston, building an openly licensed computer science textbook. I really, really like this idea.
I think this is a great idea too. So this is Open Education Week. Instead of doing a hackathon, they'll be building a textbook.
So I was thinking of, there have got to be a million other things you could do in that format, besides textbooks, but just all kinds of ways of helping do valuable things by gathering together in that kind of forum.
I think so, and that it's not, I think that we're going to see, I love the hackathon model for precisely that it brings together to folks, to hack together a solution, which, can be quick and dirty, but can be profoundly sort of subversive and brilliant. And I think that we shouldn't just see hackathons as being something that a bunch of sort of young male programmers do, and nor should it be just about building a business. It should be about solving a problem.
Love that. I want to keep playing with it. What are the Golden Monkey Awards?
Well, this is one of the startups that I picked as my favorite startups of 2011. This is Launchpad Toys. They have this wonderful app, Toontastic, which lets kids create animated, narrated videos. And coinciding with the Oscars this weekend, Launchpad is holding their own Golden Monkey Awards, where they'll be awarding things to kids who've built some of the best animations on the site. And actually, they're terrific. If you have time to sort of have a look at some of these videos, they are wonderful.
How fun. Schoology gets $1 million investment.
Yes.
Code Hero gets $200,000 from Kickstarter. What's the difference?
Well, I think the difference is one was crowdsourced by a bunch of people that chipped in anything from $1 to a couple $1,000s to help get this video game built, and the other comes as an investment from a for-profit school in Malaysia. But I think that Schoology is an interesting company that I've been tracking on since they launched, and you don't hear. I think that they're sort of quiet, heads down, quiet and working, but they seem to have quite a bit of traction. But it is interesting that they have so much so in Malaysia, that this school system in Malaysia is sort of investing some money in them.
I really like the Schoology guys. I met them, but could never really talk very far because Blackboard's purchase of Illuminate put me in kind of a competitive situation. Mm-hmm. But I'm interested to see where that goes. There's Schoology, there's Canvas by Instructure. Are there other cloud LMSs that we should be paying close attention to?
I think that there are sort of folks that are doing things. In some ways, at the K-12 level, the LMS doesn't feel like the quite the right way to describe it. I mean, I would say that, I see a number of startups that are offering services that are really well integrated with Google Apps, for example. So I think of LearnBoost, which initially was just a grade book, but now is integrated with sort of Google Docs and Google Calendar, and then there's Hapara, which is a platform, or that's sort of a dashboard and a set of tools to help make Google Apps work better in schools. And I don't know if, Edmodo is even also sort of making a gesture in that direction too with its offering. I mean, I wouldn't begin to call Edmodo an LMS, but they're offering sort of pieces of that.
Are they school management systems?
No, not. I mean, some of them are just sort of. Some of them are more. How do you? I mean, in the case of Edmodo, it's sort of classroom, a social network for your classrooms. But it does have some of that grade book, homework assignment, calendaring functionality that a traditional LMS did.
Sort of the Power School direction.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm loving the recommended reading. Really appreciate you doing that. Dan Meyer talks about math and textbooks. Dana Boyd talks about libraries and COPPA.
Yes.
And whether there really should be anything there. And then there's this We the Web Kids. So pick one or two or all three and tell us about them.
Well, I thought that Dana Boyd's piece on COPPA was really interesting, and we've touched on this before. There's so much confusion about what the requirements are around COPPA, SIPA, and FERPA, and I think that people tend to get confused about what the law really mandates and what's necessary to do in order to, quote, protect kids. And Dana makes a point quite clearly that COPPA isn't something that libraries should have to follow. COPPA is actually about websites collecting, the websites that are collecting
commercial websites.
Commercial websites that are collecting kids' information have to have certain disclosure.
Well, they can't do it.
Right.
I mean, I think that's the restriction.
Without parent permission.
Right, and Dana's saying libraries, they're nonprofits, they don't fall into that category, so why are they using COPPA as an excuse to restrict access to children under 13?
Right, and I think that, again, libraries, if they take E-rate funding, are required, do fall under the jurisdiction of SIPA, but even so, that's still, I think that there's still like this sort of confusion about anyone that's not quite 13, we need to sort of put all sorts of obstacles to them having access to the web.
I actually thought the comments to that article were fascinating as well, and kind of the thoughtful dialogue about parental rights versus child independence, and well worth the read. Anything else? Dan, of course, being Dan. Dan, of course, being Dan,
and I did have coffee last week with Dan, which was wonderful. And we actually, not surprisingly, did talk quite a bit about textbooks. And I thought that Dan's piece was really important. Thinking about, again, he's sort of continuing to sort of think through the Apple's textbook announcement. But the We the Web Kids piece, I thought, was a really interesting, and this was a manifesto written by, I believe, a Polish poet, and that was translated and shared online. It's been reprinted a couple of places, but it certainly seemed to think about how generationally, perhaps, but I'm not even sure it's a generational thing, how the notion of those of us who've sort of spent some time growing up around the internet, on the internet, how we think about the world around us and our connections and our culture. And I thought it was a really interesting look at the importance of the web as a community as a community.
Audrey, another great week. I've enjoyed getting feedback from our listeners.
Yes.
Quite a few have emailed us and
It seems we do.
Communicated in other ways, and we appreciate you. And Audrey, I appreciate you, so thanks so much for another fascinating week.
This is great.
Take care, everybody. Bye.
Bye.